Gotta remember to weigh everything before I put it on the boat. 337 grams. Okay. So I'm keeping a track of everything's rough weight before it goes in, and as I remove material from it, I'll grab up the shavings and weigh those out too. Alright, my first stem didn't fit quite properly. Well, I mean, it fit on here, but the beveling job was wrong. It was a little bit perplexing because this came off of my lofting, and usually I'm pretty much bang on. I checked my lofting, I checked everything, and it looked like everything was fine. The stem's in the right place, everything's in the right place, so the best thing to do is just move ahead and make a new part. So instead of pre-shaping it, now I'm shaping it directly on the boat. Well, I'll pull it off to cut it, but in order to determine where my bevels are going to be, I'm doing it on the boat. And so I've got some battens laid out here, following my molds. The way I figure out exactly where the bevels need to go is I use one of these little beveling tools here, and on the basically I can run it like this, pick up where this little pointer touches the stem on the inside here, and then of course I can run it over to here and pick up where it touches the stem on the outside. I'll do that in both locations, picking up both inside and outside dimensions, and this is really just carrying this line around to both sides of this, and this cutaway just allows you to get around the corner that's on there, which ultimately is going to be your bevel. So a very simple little shop-made measuring device. We make them as needed, and does a beautiful job for this kind of thing.
With our new stem shaped and installed, we can move on to the rest of the mold. I'm going to use this light batten to represent my keelson, and it's going to fare across the deadwood, and back here there's going to be a small skeg that we're going to add. This tin can kind of represents that skeg. That keelson is going to join to the horn timber right there with a small transom. The skeg is going to get added on later. It's going to be much easier to plank this area without that skeg being there. Here the port side of our mold is now strapped and gives us a real sense of form. This is pretty exciting to do, relatively easy for the most part, but it had a few tricky bits which I'll get onto in a bit. I left the starboard side unplanked, and the reason for that is I needed to bend that keelson in place, and leaving it unplanked gave me lots of places to clamp it to and to make sure it fared into that deadwood. The first step in fitting the keelson is to steam bend it in place. It's pretty stiff, so once that's done, we've taken the fight out of it and we can fit it to the rest of the parts. And the main part it has to fit to is the deadwood. After our initial fairing job on the deadwood, we're going to put the keelson back in place and check the fit. This thing is fairly stiff even after steaming, and so there's a fair bit of fussing around to try and get it just so. But for the most part it fit great, and there's just a little bit of extra work to do to try and feather out the ends of those deadwood so that it fit just perfectly. With the keelson now fitted to the deadwood and to the stem, we can move ahead with actually bonding it right to the boat, and it really only gets fastened in a few places. It gets fully glued to that deadwood and to the end of the stem, and the rest of it is just temporary fastenings. There's going to be a small transom that connects the keelson to the horn timber, but we're going to add that a little bit later on in the process. We'll wet out all the fairing surfaces with unthickened epoxy before applying thickened epoxy to make sure that we've got a rock solid 100% bond between these parts. Having all those station marks on the inside of our keelson now comes in handy while we're trying to position it with all that epoxy in place. A couple of screws do some of the temporary holding, but then we're going to add some clamps here and there just to make sure everything's perfect. So there's our keelson and deadwood construction all fastened together, and we're going to move on to fairing that out a little bit later on, but first we're going to talk about the strapping of this mold and some of the efforts that went into that. I strapped this mold just using common pine, about 1x6s, and ripped them down into 5/8 inch thick strips. Now there's the odd spot where the strips were not laying fair enough, and so I had to put a little shim in there like this, just red cedar glued in place, and that'll just get scuffed off when I do the fairing job. It's really not a big deal. This isn't about looks, this is about giving ourselves the right form. Back in the area of the tuck, things got rather tricky. I managed to get it to sort of fare together, but it's a bit piecemeal with the different little bits and pieces coming together. But now we have the other side to do, and so we get to have another kick at the can. Now it's really interesting to see how different the sides feel with one side strapped over and the other side wide open like this. Now to get going, we're going to need to fire up the steam box to deal with the twist in these little tiny planks.
Taking a very different approach to strapping this side. I'm going to go with my sort of major strap locations first. Before I just kind of worked way up from the shear with dinkety dinkety dinkety, and then as I start to get to the difficult areas, I was running into trouble trying to get it all sort of juggled in there. So I'm going to start with the difficult stuff, which is mainly dealing with the tuck here and this hard turn right down here, and then fill in the gaps after that. So that should save me a bunch of time, I think.
I'm having to steam my battens to get them to fit down into the areas of the tuck. There's quite a bit of twist there. So I'm using 1/4-inch crown staples to hold them in place. And even with that, sometimes they pop free and I have to really hit them a few times with the stapler to get them to stay put. Now you notice I'm using my little plywood jacks that I use when I'm fairing molds out in order to give myself an extra pair of hands while I'm fitting these battens in place. This was kind of a fun exercise because I had to try and fair these battens in just by eye without any specific references. The goal is to try and fill in all the spaces and to get the battens to lay down in such a way that there was minimal twist so it would be easy to fair out later on.
Yeah, I think that went definitely better. Okay, we'll try that again. That works pretty good. Right now I'm working a bunch of steelers into this area to try and make up some space. So much twist here, but I'm trying to find a more elegant way to resolve it. It's not too dissimilar from what I did on this side. It's going to look a little different on this side, but that doesn't really matter. The important thing is that it fares out. So my mold's all strapped, and my apologies for not getting it really on film. I just in one of those moods where I didn't feel like working with a camera hanging over my shoulder. Just wanted to really focus on the project itself. And the strapping, I'd love it to be prettier, but you know what? It's really not a big deal. That a mold is disposable, and if this is a mold that I was going to be using over and over and over again, I would build it differently entirely, I think. And I would certainly make it a whole lot prettier. But that said, it's faring out very nicely. Throughout the main body of it, it's really just a question of taking a long board and scuffing across. And I just try and make sure that all of my stringers get a nice little scuff across the face of it. If the odd corner doesn't get hit, that's not a huge deal. As long as the bulk of these stringers are presenting a face and the contact with the molds is good, that's good enough. I'm just going to start fairing in the stem here. And we're already pretty close. Now, of course, I'm just looking at my layout lines and trying to make sure that I'm staying close to those. Now this stem's going to have cut water on it after the planking's on. Because this is sort of a very, what I would call a modern design, they don't tend to have a lot of crisp edges on them, and the nose of this gets sort of a very rounded off profile. So it makes it a lot easier to deal with this area, because even if it's one side is out by just a hair, you're never going to notice it when it's done, compared to if you had a cut water with some very crisp edges where you had the bevel relieving into the face of it. That's a lot harder to get fair. I'm using these Dura-block longboards, and this is not an advertisement. I get nothing from these guys. Although hell, I wouldn't mind some, wouldn't mind a little backing from these guys. But anyhow, great product, I have to say. It's like when I first picked one up, I was very hesitant to do so because I felt it was pretty pricey. I can't remember what the cost of these were. They were like 30 or 40 bucks or something like that for one of these blocks. And I thought for a piece of foam, pretty expensive. And if you could get your hands on the same sort of foam, by all means, I would say just make it. But if you can't, you just need to buy them. I have to say they have saved me a ton of time over the years. They really do a beautiful job of just conforming perfectly. I mean, they're stiff enough that they really do a good job of fairing out, but then they're flexible enough that they'll conform to winds in the surface, and they're really comfortable to hang on to. I wish my adhesive backed paper would hang on to them a bit better. They tend to sort of not grab at the edges a lot of the time because dust gets in there. And I'm at a loss as to how to clean these off properly to make them stick. I've tried all kinds of different things. It never seems to work. But anyhow, I'm going over the whole boat. I'm using, say, a 36 grit longboard paper here. And the biggest challenge, of course, is back in the tuck. And we'll go take a look at that in a moment. So it's right back here in the tuck that things get really challenging. So what I found on the other side was I had these stringers spaced out a little bit, and it was really hard to judge exactly what my shape was turning into, so I tried to plank this side a little tighter. Back towards the aft, I don't really care about it because it's such a straight, easy area to deal with. I can have plenty of gaps between my planks. Right here where things change really dramatically, it's very difficult to judge what's going on. And there's a few spots where these couple of planks right here don't exactly fare together entirely the way I'd like them to, or rather it's very hard to tell exactly how they should fare together. So I've been working away at it. I got using a round bottomed longboard here, and using this sort of sweeping action I find works well for these sort of areas of drastic change. I might actually come in here with a bit of a filled epoxy and just lay in a little bit of a gob so that I can fare this through and know that I've got a good shape. To make it easier to feel those transitions. I did just a little bit of that on the other side, but of course I don't want it to be so impenetrable that I can't get a nail in there later on when I go to plank this, because I might have to tack my planking down in a few spots. And of course my wood is a little bit gummy from being in the steam box. The soft pine really sort of soaked up the moisture quite a bit, and so it's not sanding out very well. So there's only so far I can go on here today successfully, and I'm gonna have to come back and deal with it a little bit more tomorrow, I think. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with how this is turning out. I think it's gonna work out quite well. I'm pretty anxious to get on to the next job, which is fairing out the keelson. So as soon as I'm finished with the bulk of this fairing, I'm going to come back here and we're going to start beveling all of this off. And I have to remember to collect up all of my shavings because I need to weigh this out. All the parts that stay in the boat, I need to try and have a good idea as to what the finished weight is, just because I don't know how accurate a scale is we're going to have later, and it'd be nice to know exactly what does our finished boat weigh. So I'm pretty happy with my half-strapped mold idea. It certainly makes things easier in a lot of the areas to fare out because there's just less wood to deal with. But I think in these areas here where there's a lot of tighter curves, I should have strapped it solid just so that I can judge that a little bit better. Live and learn.